Fleet Marshal Simmons looked towards the star-filled void at the edge of the Agrippa system. She did not feel her 52 years, and no one rational would say she looked them either, aside from her grayed and silver hair. Her boots were planted firmly on the command bridge of the Antares, her pride and joy, the product of decades of engineering based on principles that had only been theorized until they were put into practice. The Antares was a marvel of engineering, armor, and firepower, the product of a people forced to innovate, forced to implement technologies and power systems that would have been laughed at only years prior. It was the bouncing baby behemoth of the Titan shipyard and the spawning point of a million questions that had all been answered in its creation. It was overkill personified, and while it had been kept secret up until only a few days prior, news of the Antares' existence was already causing panic. At 85 kilometers in length, 20 kilometers in width, and 10 kilometers in height, the Antares made its fleet escort look like a collection of giants' toys, with the Thunderchild Class battleships only reaching 8 kilometers as the next in line size-wise for the Terran fleet. Simmons stood on a world ender and carried herself with the presence of one who could call down that power at a gesture of her hand, or even a glance. The Antares was a full-on mobile civilization, built to not just lead a fleet but maintain it. Within its hulls were not just hangars for strike craft, even though even now, with tens of thousands of strike craft already on board, it was still at half capacity. No, the Antares had docking bays for anything up to a battleship, and the manufacturing capability on board to make any repairs needed. There were entire teams that could be dispatched with the latest in survey equipment to quite literally drag asteroids back for processing. The entire fleet could be resupplied with ammunition, replacement armor, fuel, and even full weapons systems. The only thing that the Antares couldn't make itself was food, clothing, and comfort items. The stores, however, could feed not just the vessel itself, but could function as a granary for the entire war fleet for 3 years without resupply. And comfort items? Since when was the last time anyone in the Terran front concerned with comfort? 3 million crew roamed these decks, the broad majority of systems managed by the most sophisticated AI software that could be produced. Then there were the teeth, and by God did Antares have teeth. 100 mass accelerator cannons, usually spinally mounted on cruisers and battleships, were mounted on turrets larger than skyscrapers with suspension systems so fine-tuned they could all be firing, and the ship wouldn't even vibrate. Missile pods that carried enough ordnance to devastate a continent in a single volley. Simmons thought about the railguns, fitted in 3 calibers and festooned around the Antares in clusters, and her lip twitched in a smirk. There was only one ship that could actually claim that a railgun that fired quarter-ton shells which could split a Raal destroyer in half was, in the grand scheme of things, considered a point defense weapon. She could. Laser batteries, thermal lances, the list went on. The Antares was a monster, her monster. All ships prepared for jump, awaiting your word, Field Marshal. Her navigator's words cut through Simmons's thoughts, and she looked to him as he stood at perfect attention. She slowly nodded to him, then turned to face behind her and raised her hand to beckon those that waited. She surrendered her place of honor as padded feet, and every so often the swishing of a thick tail hitting the deck sounded. Her command dais was flooded with small bodies, and throughout the fleet, she already knew that every Chua had been cycled off of watch rotations or duty assignments. This was not going to be a normal jump. For the last 2 weeks, the Antares had been the spearhead to drive the Vraal completely out of every system that had belonged to United Earth. There had been some talk about having some publicity stunt over the blasted shell that was the planet Antares, and Simmons was glad that she and the other field marshals had put that notion down. This wasn't the time to stall the advance over ritualistic mourning. Leave that to when victory was won. The Antares had left the Antares system without ever orbiting the planet that gave rise to its name, running down the shreds of Vraal resistance that lingered. Even so, when the jump had been made into Antares itself, Simmons had been hard-pressed not to feel emotional. Still, she had not made a ceremony of it after all. The second that they exited the hyperspace lane, they were going to be either under attack or immediately starting the chase for the Vraal that were in the system. Combat drones had been sent ahead before every jump, as the Vraal had started trying to mine the jump-in points. None of them had been very effective, and it had been a tactic that Simmons had long prepared for. Field Marshal Simmons was in no way willing to halt or even slow the advance they had made, but as the combat drones had jumped into the next system and reported the Vrol presence was non-existent, she had made a call. As she looked to her command dais and beyond, watching as doors along the near half-kilometer-long bridge wing let in dozens of small forms, she knew she had made the right one here. She didn't need to look down to her side to know the form that had come through the crowd that was forming, the smile on her face a bit sad. This was not just any jump. The Chua as a species stood about mid-thigh height to her. A tall one might reach 3 feet, and even then they'd be considered a giant. 3-toed on both hands and feet, with a thick and sturdy tail, the Chua reminded her of a gecko if you had made it walk upright. Their scales were brown or yellow, with the occasional black, and almost all of them seemed to have patterns of darker or lighter scales running along their bodies. They all wore their uniforms, some the camo of the Terran front ground forces, some of the machinists, some fleet. All of them had the thermal liners underneath. The one next to her had a rare scale pigmentation of near silver gray, and it was to this one in particular who wore TFGF fatigues with 5 stars along his arms and tail. "General, if you would be so kind as to give the order." Simmons looked down at the Chua, who crossed his fingers in front of himself in an almost human gesture. General Zia slowly turned his head to the side, looking at her with his right eye before turning to regard her with both eyes. He then reached up with his right hand. Simmons immediately knelt and offered her hand to Zia, who wrapped his fingers around one of her own. His free hand gently patted the back of her offered hand. Then he spoke. "Command given. Fleet." His chirped tones died out, and Simmons fought back the urge to grasp the small Chua in an embrace. He sounded so weak. To wrap the small figure in a hug uninvited would be insulting, and it would diminish his station. So she remained kneeling, watching as the Chua collected himself. After a moment, he continued. "Fleet jump, Chua home." All of the small heads turned towards the view screen as the bright and starry visual out of the viewport became streaks, then gray, suddenly turning pitch black as they entered the hyperspace lane. Simmons didn't turn her gaze away from General Zia, whose hand had stopped patting hers. His gaze was locked onto her own, and Simmons felt her jaw lock into place. His fingers holding her own index finger were locked on in a death grip. "Fleet is in transit. Lane exit in 4 minutes, 15 seconds. Her navigator reported. "Have all fighters prepared for launch once we transition," Simmons said, keeping her attention focused on Zia. The acknowledgement of her order came a moment later. The Chua were moving in tighter and tighter. "All non-essential personnel currently manning stations are ordered to make room." Again, an acknowledgement. She could see out of the corner of her eye that the Chua were taking offered hands from human crew to perch on shoulders, seated legs, or outright in the arms of their counterparts. Out of the corner of her eye, she could see her navigator standing, leaning against a bar, holding up a Chua in one arm while 2 more clung to his shoulders, looking at the viewport. Across the top in repeated text displayed on the massive near 1/10 of a kilometer pane were the words, "Arriving in Aza system," alongside a countdown. The time passed with Simmons and Zia just looking at each other, with more Chua entering the bridge wing as she knew they were doing on every ship in the fleet or anywhere else they could see. Aza was their home, their cradle system, host to a red giant star with only 2 planets that orbited it. Zia's grip on her finger did not loosen, but it was not painful. She did not need to look around as the bridge wing turned into a sea of Chua faces, silent and staring. "Exiting lane in 10 seconds, the navigator called out, and only then did Zia turn his attention to the viewport. Simmons looked with him, and her heart was already sinking. The viewport suddenly turned silver, which became streaks, then stars. In front of the viewport, about the size of a pinhead, was the distant form of the Aza system star. The Chua were silent. "Find Sakalia," General Zia chirped, the translation sounding brutishly strained in Simmons's ears. "Yes, sir. Sakalia," came a reply from off to her side, a human voice sounding as strained as Zia's. General Zia's voice was shaking as he whispered, "Magnify and enhance." Simmons' free hand balled into a fist and she squeezed her eyes shut for a moment before looking to the viewport. She walled herself off emotionally, trying to force all the emotion for not just her fellow Terran but for her friend holding her finger, because if she didn't do it, she did not know what she would do. A reticle had appeared on the viewport, surrounding a small distant object, which was rapidly beginning to fill the view screen. She turned her head and looked at the viewport. Even though their people had been starkly isolationist, stories of the beauty of the Chua homeworld had reached far beyond its borders long before humanity had even learned to cross its oceans, from ambassadors visiting the planet before humanity had even learned to cross Earth's vast oceans. Simmons remembered reading about Earth's ambassadors recounting of coming to this system and approaching this planet, and the absolute mastery of how the Chua molded their entire society to their birth world. Endless gardens of every design, breathtaking beauty, a world that was so wild yet somehow so tamed, all by the small hands of a species that simply wanted to be left to tend those gardens undisturbed. Tsakalia, the world garden, the cradle of the Chua, was a horror of jagged craters and scars. Impact points from orbital weapons marked the surface of a world that had been the crowned jewel of the Chua since they had left their atmosphere 3,000 years prior. Jagged lines from thermal lances tore through mountain ranges. The atmosphere was choked with storms that simply broiled with lightning, clouds supplied by oceans that had been boiled away by constant bombardment. No gardens would grow here, not for 10,000 years. Unwanted and unbidden images of Earth flashed through her head. How would she feel if one of those craters was Tallahassee, Florida, her hometown? How would she feel if this was her world? Xia's grip on her finger slipped, and she looked back to the Chua as his arms hung limp at his sides, staring at the hell his homeworld had become. Simmons did not talk. There weren't words for times like this. Of course they knew, as she did. The Vral made no secret that they had glassed the planet from orbit. For over 50 years, the Vral had made sure to broadcast the images of Tsakalia being wounded. There was a difference between seeing on a screen versus seeing it in person. The entire bridge wing was silent, staring at the lifeless rock, a testament to the cruelty that they had all endured. Simmons didn't know where the sound started from, but somewhere in the standing room-only area a high-pitched, soft and plaintive howl began. One voice became two, which became several, spreading like a wave. The noise was soft, barely above a whisper, a low resonance of a species in pain, a chorus of soft voices, an ocean. Simmons couldn't look at them in their pain, but a flash of white in the corner brought her head around as Tikka, the Tyrannica ambassador, stood silently in the back of the room. The long neck of the bird-like ambassador was curled down, his long beak slowly turning as he took in the sight of the Chua all around him. Simmons's eyes fell from Tikka to the Chua themselves, mouths slightly parted, howling softly at their dead cradle world. Simmons hunched her neck and crushed her eyelids together, hearing as Xia himself added his voice to the soft call of his people to all they had lost. "Look at what you did, you bastard!" She felt like screaming at the Tyrannica. She felt like wringing his neck, anything to distract her. The Chua had insisted at the outbreak of the First Vral War that this world needed to be abandoned if there was any chance of the humans and the Chua surviving at all. The Chua had lent their natural skill at preservation and overall avoidance of waste to the Antares project that had birthed the very vessel they now stood on, mourning the price they had paid for survival. The sound began to slowly die down, seeming to spread silence the same way the whispered howl had begun, spreading to what could have been thousands of the Chua. Simmons lowered her head as she brought herself under control. She felt like making a speech. She felt like saying something, anything that could inspire or lead. Words simply failed her. It was probably best to say nothing right now anyway. She heard some shuffling as the Chua, ever pragmatic, began to turn. She still couldn't look at them, nor at him, even though she felt General Xia's presence by her leg. As the Chua began to file out, she prepared herself mentally to simply issue the orders to progress to the Mandeville point, to set the watch, and begin scouting the Isiact system with drones. She sent another knife-edged glare towards Tikka, but the ambassador had turned his back towards the door. She knew she had every reason to despise the Tyrannica ambassador, the one who had brokered the sale of her people and so many others for the Vral. But she also knew she was walking a fine line now between justified anger and spite, which she considered beneath her. Angry glances were beneath her. More snide comments were beneath her. Strangling the long-necked bird on the command dais of the bridge wing and hurling his carcass out of an airlock. Not so beneath her. She shook her head and prepared to raise her voice when she was suddenly caught off guard. "Field Marshal, signal received." Simmons turned her head to look in the direction of the voice, a young non-commissioned communications officer who was looking at his terminal with a mixture of shock and disbelief. A Chua was standing on his armrest, still looking at their former homeworld. "This had better not be what I think it is," Simmons almost growled. The last thing she wanted to hear was that the Vral had left some parting gift for them. "No, ma'am." The comms officer's eyes snapped up to her, and he promptly reached up, ripping his headset off. The Chua next to him recoiled in alarm as the crewman shoved the earmuff of his headset to the Chua's ear. Simmons felt her heart suddenly seize in her chest. She felt like screaming at the crewman, demanding clarification, when suddenly the Chua who was listening to the signal being held to his ear started jumping, grabbing the headset from the crewman who began laughing. The Chua had stopped, some of them looking back as the Chua with the earpiece began to trill wildly, pointing at the planet. Whatever he was saying wasn't translating, if he was saying anything at all. Simmons' hand clutched at her heart and she looked down to Zia, who was looking back at the comm station with his small mouth hanging open. "Put it on the shipwide. Now!" Simmons screamed as she spun and looked at the planet. Her voice cratered to a whisper as she looked at the complete destruction that was the Chua homeworld. The speakers crackled to life, interlaced with heavy static. "Depart enemy Gondom. Survivors. Still here to need glide. Ves. Clean it." Simmons's hand slammed down on the guardrail. "Aye." She heard the crewman yell out, and as she glanced back she saw several other crewmen rushing towards the station. They didn't speak, simply watching, waiting, looking up from the terminal to the speakers. And now, the crewman called out after the longest 30 seconds Simmons had experienced in her career. As the cleared audio began to play, the bridge wing erupted. "Vral depart Aza system. Enemy gone. Survivors. We still here. Repeat. Tsakalia calling. Sub-level bunkers active. Vral depart system. Enemy gone. Survivors. We still here. Respond. Repeat." The chirps and clicks of the Chua language were interlaced with the translation. Simmons had to scream to be heard as the Chua surged back onto the bridge wing, trilling wildly alongside shouts of the humans. "I want that fucking signal heard on every ship." She looked back to the crewman who was being shaken to pieces by humans and Chua alike, even as he gripped his terminal to comply with her order. The bridge wing had dissolved into nothing more or less than a madhouse, and Simmons looked back at the planet. She had 1,000 orders to give, 1,000,000 questions. She suddenly became aware that she was being called for, and she looked back to the crewman who was still being mobbed. He was yelling, but she couldn't hear him, as suddenly something small and light hit her in the chest, and she quickly embraced the form of General Zia, who had leapt up into her arms and was using her to be seen. He was raising his hand towards the Chua, who were ignoring everything right now. Simmons started laughing. Then she realized that someone down there was calling and needed a response. Her hand subconsciously snapped out, grabbing hold of a transmitter for the ship-wide broadcast system. She hammered her hand down on the receiver and held it to her mouth. "Everyone, shut the fuck up!" Her voice thundered over the ship-wide speakers. The noise instantly died down. Wide-eyed, she stared with an almost fanatical look at the crewman as the signal from Tsakalia repeated again. And she could tell from the cadence that it was a Chua living and breathing, not some automated message. The sound of one of the Tyrannika's feathers hitting the floor would have been audible for the silence on the bridge, now save for the sound of the Chua homeworld calling out. "Tell them we're coming," she said, and the crewman nodded, grabbing his headset and shoving it back on over his ears. He adjusted his microphone. "Tsakalia, this is Antaris. Your message has been received. We're coming for you." The crewman said once into the microphone of his headset, and within 2 seconds of him beginning to speak, the voice on the other end stopped. "Give him a time frame, let's go." Simmons called to her navigator, who was already busy plotting out the course, midway through, tears in his eyes and grinning. The navigator held up 2 fingers and mouthed hours. The crewman immediately spoke into his headset. "We will reach orbit of Tsakalia in 2 hours. How do you read?" "Antares, this Tsakalia garden bloom." The voice came through the ship-wide speakers as well as to the rest of the fleet. Simmons started laughing as the bridge wing instantly devolved into abject chaos again, and she held the receiver up to her mouth as her laughter stopped. The dozens of orders that she needed to give in the next 20 minutes alone was going to be staggering, but she didn't care. She didn't even know where or how to begin right now. She said the only thing she could think to say, "Let's fucking go." In the space between the Mandeville Point and Tsakalia, the entire combined might of the fleet began to move. On the tactical displays that showed the Chua homeworld, several green icons began to light up one after the other, 5, then 20, then 50, marking beacons that had been lit. Journalists who had been stationed throughout the fleet tried to send signals back to the Terran front, having to yell to be heard over the sounds of first celebration. Then orders as a fleet designed to annihilate converted everything it could to recovery. Within 20 minutes of the first broadcast, a small fleet departed from Thermopylae Station, heading to Antares, with the sole purpose of looking for survivors where there shouldn't be any. On the bridge of the Antares, amidst the celebration, then amidst the recovery, Ambassador Tikka stood silent witness. No one spoke to him. No one even looked his way. He remained motionless with his silent guardians nearby, 2 humans. On the surface, he wanted to feel elated for the Chua, but he couldn't. He only felt a crippling sadness, a savage cut to his heart that he felt he might never recover from, and in truth he knew he shouldn't recover from it. No one around him understood why his wings were arched up, his neck curled into a sharp S shape, as to why his legs were bent at an almost 45-degree angle. No one even cared to look. The humans always were easy to read by their expressions, unless, of course, they were hiding how they felt. The Turinica didn't have that ease of expression, and it was easier to hide how they were feeling. Tikka didn't care who knew. In fact, he wanted someone to see him. He wanted someone to understand. Tikka rustled his feathers every so often, deepening the S-curve of his neck. To a human, the avian ambassador was simply behaving strangely. If another member of his species saw him, they would be awestruck at the display of absolute shame. On Earth, several hours later, an elderly man sat back in his chair as he watched the first broadcasts from the hangars of the Antares, showed Chua who had been surviving underground for over 90 years, raising families far from the light of their sun, who had endured as their planet had died over their heads. A lone tear streaked down his cheek as he saw a reunion he didn't believe possible occur. As he was watching, a young girl walked in a child's version of the uniforms he was seeing on his holo. She was carrying a replica model of the new A44 pulse rifle used to teach a child how to break down and reassemble the real thing. His hand reached out and took hold of her arm, and the young girl looked to him. "Papa?" she asked, and slowly he met her eyes, barely over 6 years of age. He reached out and took the rifle from her and set it down. She looked to the holo, then back to him. "News about what Dad is doing?" "Sure was, Claire Bear," he said, using a nickname for her that she liked. He took the remote for the holo and turned it off. Another fresh tear rolled down his cheek. She smiled at him, and he reached up and ran his fingers through her hair. "Why are you crying, Papa?" Claire asked, and didn't resist as her grandfather drew her in, hugging her close. "Because I'm happy, Claire Bear," he said. "I'm very happy." He held his granddaughter close, wishing his son was home, but knowing from experience why he was so many light years and jumps away. "Tell you what, don't worry about practice now, let's go outside." At first, Claire just didn't know what to do when her grandfather took her by the hand and they walked out to the small backyard of their family's house. She had spent her short life in a state of constant business from waking until sleep. Everything was a lesson. She had to take things seriously because it was very important that she do so. She had to make sure that she did her family proud, and the Terran front, because one day she would need to protect her papa, and her dad, and her mother too, just like they had done. When she asked what she was supposed to do, her papa just motioned to the yard and told her to explore. 10 minutes later, still trying to understand what the lesson was here, she found a bird's nest sitting in a low branch. Curious, she began to climb the tree where the nest was. Her boots made climbing hard, but she wanted to see the nest up close. She kicked the steel-toed boots off and began climbing again. She didn't want to disturb the nest if there was a family there, but even she could tell that this nest had been there for a while, and no one lived in it. "Papa, look," she called out, looking back to where her grandfather was sitting. "Papa, look," she called again, pointing at the bird's nest. "What kind of bird makes this? Look, Papa!" Her voice grew louder and more urgent. "Let me see if I've got a book on birds. We might just find out." Her papa called back to her, and she looked back to him. "Stay right there. I'll be right back out." She waved excitedly and looked back at the nest as her grandfather went back inside. Inside the house, as soon as he was out of sight of his granddaughter, the elderly man slowly went down to his knees. He was reaching for a small book when tears clouded his vision, an old one. A sudden cry from outside rang out and his head snapped back towards the door, and then the dam broke. In the backyard, his granddaughter shrieked in happiness as she was out of the tree, then was seemingly entranced as a bird landed on the top branches. Clyde Andrews of RG-113 started to sob uncontrollably, covering his mouth so he wouldn't make a sound, watching as his granddaughter played in the backyard.